Paul Manafort, guilty, convicted on 8 counts, including false tax returns, failing to file foreign bank account reports, and 2 counts of bank fraud. The judge declaring a mistrial in the remaining 10 counts, Trump choosing to talk about Manafort, but not Cohen.
Paul Manafort's a good man. He was with Ronald Reagan. He was with a lot of different people over the years, and I feel very sad about that. It doesn't involve me, but I still feel, it's a very sad thing that happens. This has nothing to do with Russian collusion.
Prosecutors have 8 days to decide what they want to do about the mistrial charges. Ty Kelly is a former federal prosecutor and former Department of Justice lawyer, where she worked for Rod Rosenstein. And Seth Waxman is a former federal prosecutor. Ty, let me just ask you, at this point, what's the signal that you read into Donald Trump saying what he said about what a great guy Manafort is and how he worked for Reagan and he worked for Bob Dole and it's terrific and it's awful what's happening to him? Is that a signal to Manafort and his legal team? Don't fold?
Well, I mean, it could be looked at that way, but I think that President Trump is doing what he's always been doing, which is to distance himself entirely from whatever he can. This is a significant conviction for Paul Manafort. Even though there's a number of mistrials, the significance of the criminal convictions are large. And so just to distance himself from someone who's just been convicted of very serious crimes is what he looks like he's doing.
Seth, talk to me about the mistrials versus the convictions. There were no acquittals. What does this mean in the context of this trial and its success?
Yeah, I mean, you can't look at this as anything but a sweeping victory for the prosecution. You know, to get someone on serious bank fraud, tax evasion charges, Mr. Manafort will be facing essentially a life sentence given his age, whether that's 11 years or 15 years. The judge will have a decision on whether to stack those crimes in sentencing. And, the key point to all of this may be, when the smoke clears, is Paul Manafort going to cooperate? Is he going to walk into Mueller's office, say, you got me, I need a deal now? And then, of course, the X factor that's very difficult for all of us to answer, is the president going to issue a pardon?
Ty, I'm just looking at emails, tweets from Lindsey Graham that came out a little while ago, where he said the American legal system is working its will in both the Paul Manafort and Michael Cohen cases. Thus far, there have yet to be any charges or convictions for colluding with the Russian government by any member of the Trump campaign in the 2016 election. So somebody's holding out hope that this isn't connected.
Well, I mean, I'm sure there's plenty of people who are holding out hope that this isn't connected, but I think Judge Ellis said it best. I mean, it's very routine in an investigation and prosecution to be putting pressure on people to do exactly what Seth was just talking about, cooperating. And now Mr. Manafort is absolutely looking at a very significant jail time, and he's going to have to make some really difficult decisions.
All right, and let me ask you, Megan, what you think, what you're expecting. We saw this first response from a senator. Do you think this turns yet, or do you think everybody's just going to keep their powder dry?
I think we're all going to be watching. I mean, I think this really feels like one of the more remarkable days of the Trump presidency, which is saying a lot.
Filled with remarkable days.
Saying a lot, but yeah, I mean, to go back to what happens next. I mean, it's also interesting to note that if it's not right now, it's not directly connected to the Russian investigation, but it's clear that if Cohen were to provide valuable information to Mueller, that could, in fact, affect his sentence. And I think that's another thing that, there's going to, to be watching as we move forward.
Right now, he's looking at 43 to 64 months or something in that category. That's what the guidelines say. Right. He might be looking at getting a reduced sentence if he's able to bring something to the table.
He would not plead to that without a cooperation agreement. Yeah. I mean, normally I do these all the time in the criminal practice, and you get a cooperation agreement that's under seal, and you have a plea agreement like you have here that's public. So I would bet anything that there is a cooperation agreement with Mueller's office, and he's looking to bring down that sentence, which the judge can bring down to 0 if he wants, under enough cooperation. So I don't think he would ever plead guilty to anything approaching 5 or 6 years without a cooperation agreement.
Let me bring Natasha Bertrand in from The Atlantic. She was in the Manafort courtroom today. What do you think happens with that? I mean, we have to remember Manafort's got a whole nother trial coming up, and the sense was, regardless of what happens in this trial, the government continues to be able to put more pressure on him. Do you think he heads into that other trial, given what happened today, or do you think he starts to think of either figuring out whether he's getting a pardon or figuring out whether he's got to sing like a bird about what happened in Trump Tower and other things having to do with the Russians?
I think it is possible that he chooses to cooperate with Mueller now that he faces so much prison time, having been convicted on 8 counts. It was somewhat of a surprise that he was found that the jury could not come to a consensus on 10 counts when the jury gave a note to the judge saying that they could not reach a consensus on 1 count. Everyone in the courtroom kind of assumed that it just meant 1 count and that they would reach a consensus on the other 17. So you could see that as somewhat of a small victory for the defense, but this was really a sweeping success for the prosecution. And we have to remember that Mueller's team has already said that they have 3 times as much evidence for the September trial as they did for this trial, over 1,000 pieces of evidence versus just under 300 for this trial. So there's definitely an incentive for Paul Manafort to work with the government now that he's seen that a jury is willing to convict him on charges like these. But I would also not hold our breath because no one thought that Manafort would go to this trial either. Ty,
this case, while it was a lot of it was documentary and paper trail-y, the fact is these complicated cases are hard for juries because people don't understand some of the terms that are in them. Is that second trial going to be easier for the government? Does Paul Manafort get to think, all right, well, if they got me on 8 charges here, I'm in trouble in the next one?
I think what Paul Manafort's team is looking at right now and noticing is that the jury didn't convict on any of the conspiracy to commit bank fraud charges. So out of all the bank fraud charges, the jury only came to a guilty verdict on 2 of them and had a mistrial on all of the conspiracy to commit bank fraud. That could be something that the Mueller team needs to focus on, which is, can we rely on Gates? The jury could have been signaling, we're not going to convict on something that we need to believe Gates on. And so you may see Mueller's team shuffling to figure out which of their counts, which of their evidence they can shore up without needing Gates. Right.
So, Seth, when you think about this from the perspective that Nick gave us, and that is that the real prize here for the Mueller investigation is going to be Russia, not even the payoffs to Stormy Daniels or Karen McDougal. Does the government, does the prosecution in Manafort, do they tie him to it in the second trial? Are they able to do that? Because it's still a conspiracy to defraud the United States trial.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very similar to the one we just saw in Alexandria. Russia will be in the background. Conspiracies don't just drop out of the sky in spring of 2016. There's a backstory to all conspiracies. So Manafort's interactions with the Russians, and to the extent there are foreign accounts related in the D.C. trial in the fall, there will be some, discussion about that. But I think very similar to the Alexandria trial, it'll be kind of a straightforward, white-collar criminal prosecution that'll be document-based, maybe a cooperator or 2 sprinkled in here and there. And the big question for me is whether that case is ever going to take place. Is Mr. Manafort going to walk in and say, look, right now I'm facing 10 years. That's tantamount to a life sentence, essentially. Let me work with you. And, of course, again, the pardon is the X factor.